Today we will be delving deep into the strange and beyond. 3 no-sleep stories, all very different from one another, but all horrific in their own individual ways. A huge thank you to the writers. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, a like and a comment is always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I am in no way superstitious. I love horror movies, love folklore and mythologies, and have great respect for religion. My parents sometimes get a bit irritated about it, saying that I only believe the things I see. Having come from a religious family, I'm expected to follow Jesus wherever he goes. Honestly, it's a bit of a drag. I can't live a life following such tight rules. I feel it takes away the human part of humans. My lack of faith is also the reason why I don't believe in ghosts, which is pretty ironic since I study in a high school that's supposedly haunted. My group of friends is in love with the supernatural. We're kind of like ghost investigators. When you're studying in a school that's more than 200 years old, it's impossible to keep the rumors from flying around like crazy. One moment a kid sees a ghost in the school basement. The next there are ghouls rising from the cabbage patch in the garden. We've pretty much debunked every rumor we hear. Takes about a day or two to find a logical explanation. Strange howling on rainy days, echoing winds as it passes through rooms. Scary screeching in the basement, our jacked up janitor scratching metal with artificial claws again. There was, however, one mystery we couldn't debunk. Students, even staff, have reported crying from within the mop closet. Sobbing, some would say. Some even heard wailing that echoed far into the corridors at night. This, for some reason, we couldn't find an explanation to. There was only so much we could do. The closet was inaccessible to everyone but the janitors who held the key, and there was no CCTV installed within, so we set up cameras and audio recorders outside, but that didn't pick up anything out of the ordinary. I was about to close the case on the crying mop closet as some sort of gag to scare people, given our school's background. I didn't believe it myself. Until one fateful day arrived, that I would learn that there is more to life than what we can physically sense. Something that would scar me forever. I'd finished up doing my business in the boys' restroom when suddenly, as I was washing my hands to conclude my potty trip, the school's broadcast system came on. The voice was a lady's, who usually calls kids over to the principal's office or announces some special news that everybody needed to hear. That type of stuff. But this time it was different. Her voice was in its usual calm, but it was off. You could hear the sense of fright laced in every word, like she was carefully piecing her sentence together. Apparently the school was on emergency lockdown, telling the teachers to lock the doors, shut all windows, and turn off all the lights. An armed man had entered the school's premises, carrying a gun. He had shot the guard outside and was on his way in. Naturally, I became panicked. The lights had gone off in the bathrooms, indicating all the power must have gone. Fighting my urge to stay and hide in a cubicle, I fled to the corridors. It wasn't my first time exploring these corridors in pitch blackness. I've done it many times in the past with my friends, ghost hunting. I wasn't scared of the dark, but the skin-turning dread you get when you realize that there existed an actual threat, lurking in those very corridors, that could actually kill me, it made my blood flow through me faster than I am comfortable with. As much as I hated it, I turned on my phone's flashlight for safe navigation. I knocked on every door I passed, asking, begging them to let me in, but none responded. I wouldn't have. As far as they knew, I was the lunatic carrying a weapon. I needed to hide, and fast. My light would have definitely attracted unwanted attention. That's when I saw him. As I ran farther into the hall, passing by the cafeteria and the library, my light caught the silhouette of a man, standing erect, watching me in the dark. As if on instinct, my hands immediately turned off the lights. I was bathed in darkness. I didn't want to turn them back on, so I just ran as quick and as quiet as I could. Feeling my way down the corridor, I could hear him after me. He didn't even try to hide his echoing footsteps. His shoes tapped against the floor in rapid succession, far into the hall behind me. They were approaching fast. I thought that was it for me, but my hands didn't stop searching. I felt a doorknob in the dark that was unlocked. I had never entered a room so fast in my life. I shut it behind me and locked it. I felt around for whatever else was in the room and barricaded the door. I think it was a divider or something, as there were a lot of things that fell as I dropped it in front of the door. It wasn't too long after that the man arrived and started banging on the door. I fell to the floor and pushed myself away until I felt the cold wall on my back. I heard sobbing. Somebody must have been hiding in there with me. Judging from the tone, it must have been a girl. I tried feeling around again, ignoring every leap my heart makes every time that man slammed the door. Finally, I found a hand and gripped it tight. It was unusually cold. Poor thing. She must have been so scared. The sobbing turned into cries, and I felt an urge to protect this person I was with. I located the rest of the body and hugged it tight. It's okay. We're gonna be fine. We're gonna be fine. I whispered over and over into her ears. Gunshots rang as bullets punched holes through the door. She wailed loudly in terror. I pulled her closer, trying to hide my own fear from my life. The shots continued until the man completely emptied his clip. I heard the gun drop to the floor, followed by footsteps. I thought at first he was leaving, then I realized he was going back and forth outside the door, banging occasionally, but mostly walking back and forth. The whole time, the girl and I sat there. I rocked her gently, trying to ease what frightful horrors her mind must have been conjuring. She kept crying. I kept trying to calm her down. After a few minutes of silence from the man, he began to speak. "Listen, I know you won't believe me, but... God..." His voice sounded scared, almost desperate. "You need to let me in. I have to get in there, please." I didn't respond. I sat there, listening to this insane man's pleas, almost with pity. "You can't tell anyone, okay? If they knew, they'd send me away. I don't want to be sent away." The man banged on the doors again. "Just let me in. Let me in and I promise I won't hurt you. You have to." For almost an hour I listened to this man beg. I tried to decipher what he was trying to tell me, but none of what he said made any sense. Don't tell anyone? I had to let him in? And they'd send him away? What was he trying to convey? His pleading could not have been more cryptic. All of his words registered as nonsense in my brain. I took comfort in burying myself in the girl's head, trying not to go insane with his loud, meaningless bickering. Relief flooded me when I heard those familiar sirens out on the open road. The police had come and entered the building. It didn't take long for the man to be in their custody. Thankfully, the guard had survived the gunshots, and nobody else got hurt. When the police found me and the girl, they froze in place. The teachers accompanying them screamed in terror. One of them even fainted. In my arms, I clutched the body of a pale girl, with multiple stab wounds across the chest. It took a whole week for the events to click sensibly in my brain. Now I understood what the man was trying to do. Turns out the armed man was our jacked up janitor, who got fired a day prior to the lockdown events. The man had been preying on the unsuspecting girls of our school. This girl had been dumped in the mop closet I hid in. She was one of his unfortunate victims. I don't even know how he got a job in our school. God, I could only hope she was the last. What happened in those events would unfold in my head over and over until the day I die. But there was still one question that haunted me every night I went to bed. Who was crying in that closet I was in? You know that horror movie trope about mirrors? The one where the protagonist is near a mirror and they look or shift away from the mirror for just a moment, and when they look back, a ghost, killer, or some other entity appears, and then usually rapidly disappears when they turn around. I've always disliked looking into mirrors, and for a while, I convinced myself that it was caused by an overactive imagination, combined with seeing the situation play out one too many times in a movie. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that it's much more than that. I don't dislike looking into mirrors. I'm afraid of it. Something has always just felt off about it. I recognize the image in my reflection as me, but it has never felt familiar. I brought it up once to a friend, and she goggled at me for a moment, and then laughed, though I could hear a tinge of fear behind it. "What do you mean? You don't recognize your reflection? How is that even possible?" It's the same reflection that you've been staring at your whole life. And she was right, of course. But that was part of the problem. My reflection has never felt normal to me. Not in the way that it should. Not in the way that it does to other people. I've observed the reflections of friends and family members when they're standing near mirrors. It doesn't feel the same. It feels connected to them, a simple mirror image. Then when their eyes meet mine in the mirror, I don't feel the oppressive feeling of other that I get when I meet my own eyes in my reflection. With no explanation that seemed to fit my experiences, I chalked it up to just being a weird quirk and decided to just get on with my life. When I moved into my first apartment by myself, I removed all of the mirrors, except for one that I kept in my guest room. It stayed covered with a sheet unless I absolutely needed it. You'd be surprised how well you can get by without mirrors when you've been doing it your whole life. I even got pretty good at applying makeup without seeing what I was doing. Every once in a while, I'd catch my reflection in a mirror in a public bathroom, or if I looked wrong into my rearview mirror, and it would set my heart racing. I always felt menaced when it happened, and it would take me a few moments to calm down again. But all in all, I was doing fairly well with my mirror avoidance strategies. But that all changed one day at work. I work in the artifact restoration department in my city's history museum. It's typically fascinating, delicate, and detailed work, and I love it. I mostly work with pottery or statues and carvings, but I always knew that one day someone would bring me an antique mirror to restore, and I would have no choice but to do it. I'd been at the museum for 5 years, and it still hadn't happened. I'd almost convinced myself that I was in the clear. Alas, that was not the case. It was late on a Friday when it was first brought to me. The museum director had it wheeled in under a sheet, but I immediately knew what it was. I could tell from the dread that practically exploded inside me. He beamed at me as he whipped the sheet off. "It's magnificent," he crowed. "Early 1700s, French." He smiled at me, waiting for my exclamations over its beauty, I'm sure. My breath felt like it was caught in my throat, and I stared down my full reflection for the first time in what had been years. It looked back at me, also with a petrified expression, but it felt different, like my reflection's face was an act, a mimicking of my face, not an exact copy. I stood transfixed for a minute, trapped under my own gaze. Suddenly the director stepped into my line of view, blocking the mirror from my sight. "Well, what do you think? Gorgeous, isn't it? Doesn't look like it needs too much work. A little spit shine, maybe," he said with a grin, winking at me. "Yeah, gorgeous," I mumbled. He must have noticed how white I had gotten, because he recovered the mirror and put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't stress about it. I know you'll do a great job, and don't worry about starting today. You can get cracking on Monday." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving me alone with the mirror. I put my head in my hands and rubbed my temples with my thumbs. "Okay, you can do this," I whispered to myself. "You have the whole weekend to prepare." I looked up at the clock, 5:15. I grabbed my things and headed for the door. I'd deal with the mirror on Monday. I'd almost made it all the way out of the building when I realized I had left my keys on my work table. "Crap," I moaned. But there was nothing to be done for it. I needed the keys to lock up the building. Before I opened the door back to my workspace, I took a deep breath. "It's just a stupid mirror," I said to myself. I stepped into the room. Everything looked normal. I stepped quickly past the mirror to my desk. I bent to open the drawer where I kept my keys, and when I turned around, the sheet that had been covering the mirror moments before was in a pile on the floor in front of it. My knees went weak, and I had to grab onto my desk to keep from buckling. "It just fell, that's all," I whispered out loud. When I walked by it quickly, it made a breeze that knocked it off. I felt deep down that this was not what had happened at all, but saying it out loud gave me enough courage to approach the mirror to replace the sheet. Once I was in front of it, I knelt down to grab the sheet, never once taking my eyes off my reflection. As I straightened back up, I turned to face the mirror head on. With one hand, I reached out and lightly pressed my fingertips against my reflections. My fingers stopped at the cold, hard glass. It was cold enough that the warmth from my fingers fogged up a little area around each tip. My reflection had the tiniest of smiles playing around her lips. I didn't feel myself smiling, but it was such a small one perhaps I didn't notice myself doing it. I rearranged my face into grotesque poses, just to make sure my reflection did it too. She did, but it brought me little comfort. I took a step forward until my face was practically touching the mirror. I could see every pore, every freckle. It looked familiar, but it felt alien. I breathed onto it, fogging the surface in front of my face. I slowly traced a heart into the fog. I saw my reflection do the same, but then I noticed something odd. I could see the hearts I drew in the reflection. My heart began to thump wildly in my chest. I hastily used my sleeve to wipe away the remnants of my breath. The fog in the reflection, however, remained. I sucked in a sharp breath of air and took a staggering step back. I pressed my palms into my eyelids until I saw stars. I slowly counted to 10 and opened my eyes. All I could see was my reflection staring worriedly back at me. She looked pale and faint, exactly how I felt, but it still didn't look or feel quite right. I threw the sheet back over the mirror and ran out of the building. By the time I arrived home, I'd calmed down significantly, enough that I was suddenly able to remember that I had a date that night. I groaned out loud. I didn't really want to go, but I actually do like this guy. We'd already been on a few dates and had hit it off pretty well, so I pulled myself together the best I could. By the time Nick arrived to pick me up, I had shaken off the vestiges of my earlier terror. Well, at dinner, he asked me how my day had been. I hesitated, not wanting to tell him about what had happened, or about my irrational and odd reactions to mirrors. But I suddenly realized that I had a desperate desire to tell someone about what had happened, even if it made me sound crazy. I relayed the story to him, never once looking into his eyes. I didn't want to see what I knew would be reflected there. Fear, anxiety, disgust. But when I finished and did look up, he was simply studying me. After a moment, he reached out and took my hand. "You know what I read once?" he asked. I shook my head silently. It was on one of those microblogs, social media sites. It said, "What if the only reason we can't walk through mirrors is that our reflection blocks us? What if they know that the other side is horrifying and painful, and they are trying to keep us from ever crossing over?" He shrugged. "Just a weird thing I read, but it sounds like yours isn't trying to protect you. It's trying to get out of there." He said with a laugh, "Wouldn't that be something? That would explain why you feel like you do." I sat in stunned silence. My throat was as dry as the desert. I had to forcefully swallow several times before I could speak again. Yeah, that would be something. My mind was racing with what he had said as we left the restaurant. His little theory perfectly described how I felt, but I didn't know what to do with that information. It was nonsense, after all. I wanted only to go home at that point, but Nick grabbed my hand. "I actually have something in mind for us to do tonight, but it's a surprise." I sighed internally, but smiled at him. Sure, lead the way. We caught a cab and got out in front of what looked like an old abandoned warehouse. I might have thought that's what it was, too, if it wasn't for the line of people out the door. "What's this?" I asked. "It's an adventure space," he said with a huge smile. "Kind of like a playhouse for grown-ups. I've seen it advertised all over the place. There's supposed to be things to explore and climb on, stuff like that." I couldn't help but smile at his infectious excitement. "Okay, let's check it out," I said with a giggle. The first few rooms were indeed a lot of climbing and twisting and bending and crawling. We kept losing each other and then finding each other by the sound of our laughter. I was surprised at how much fun I was having. He grabbed my hand as we moved towards the last room. "I think you'll like this one the best," he said, pulling me forward. I was about to ask why, but the word died on my lips as we walked through the doorway. It was a room full of mirrors, a much larger and more terrifying version of a funhouse made for children. He shoved me farther into the room so that the door slammed shut behind us. "To help you get over your fear," he said with another shove. Never before had I felt the level of fear that rose in my chest at that moment. It was all-consuming. It wiped nearly every other thought from my mind. I was facing down hundreds of my own reflection, and they looked horrifying. I turned to Nick to beg him to help me get out of there, but he had disappeared. "Nick?" I croaked, my voice cracking with terror. "Nick!" I screamed. I heard him laughing as he shouted, "This way!" I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, unable to tell which way was correct. Tears began pouring out of my eyes as I struggled to breathe under the weight of my panic. Every direction I looked was a reflection of myself, each one looking more ominous than the last. I turned a corner and saw hundreds of reflections of the back of my head, all lined up in a row. I was paralyzed with fear. I closed my eyes and took a few shuddering deep breaths. "Nick!" I called out again. This time I got no answer. I knew to get out I was going to have to open my eyes. There was no way I was going to make it out of there blind. I opened my eyes and was greeted with the same sight I had seen when I had closed them. I exhaled loudly. A tiny wave of relief hit me. I heard a noise to my right and turned my head that way. "Nick?" I asked again. When I looked forward again, all of my reflections were facing away from me, all except the one in front. She was facing me with a horrible grin plastered onto her face. She beckoned for me. Frozen in place, I could only shake my head no. When I didn't move forward, her grin turned into a snarl, and she began slamming her fists against the glass. I let out a blood-curdling scream as I saw my vision go spotty. I stepped back in such a panic that I smashed into the mirror behind me. I felt a sharp pain in the back of my head as a shower of glass rained down around me. I'm certain I passed out for a moment, both from pain and fear. When I came to, I could feel something warm and sticky dripping down my neck. I reached up my hand and it came away bloody. I moaned. I could faintly hear Nick yelling for me. I dragged myself up into a sitting position, wincing as my hands and legs got farther cut up from the glass. Across the room I could see Nick, and hundreds of Nick's reflections, kneeling down in front of me. I closed and rubbed my eyes, shaking my head in the process. How could Nick be with my reflection when he wasn't here with me? I must have hit my head harder than I thought to myself. I could hear him talking, but it sounded muted and far away. I heard the word help, but not much more. He stood up and sprinted for the door. I couldn't tell if he was coming back or not, and as it seemed like I could get up and walk, I decided to try. I was still anxious to get out of this hall of horrors. I finally made it to the exit door. It had become extremely foggy and unseasonably cold while we were inside. The air had a terrible metallic tang to it that filled my nose and mouth. I shivered in the wind that whipped brutally around me. As I glanced around, I realized that I didn't see anyone else nearby. No people, no cars, nothing. Grimacing, I whipped out my phone to call for an ambulance myself, but the battery was dead. "Come on!" I yelled out in frustration. I slowly started hobbling towards the road. I figured I could at least catch a cab, but there was no one on the road either. I began to cry. What a nightmare this night turned out to be. I staggered home, alone and freezing. When I got back inside, I plugged my phone in. I needed to let someone know that I was hurt and where I ended up. When the phone powered on, a barrage of texts came in, mostly from Nick, but they were all jumbled up. A random mix of letters, numbers, and symbols. I couldn't make heads or tails of any of it. I tried to send a text back, but it refused to send. I couldn't even get a signal to make a call. Panic, bitter like bile, threatened to rise up again, but I fought it off. I would deal with the shoddy cell service later. For now I needed to take care of myself. Once I started to clean myself up, I quickly realized that most of my cuts were shallow or superficial. I was able to get the glass out, and get everything cleaned up on my own. Well, every piece except one. I could feel one near the top of my head that I just couldn't get a good grip on. I closed my eyes and let out a deep breath. I was going to need to use the mirror. I hobbled into the guest room and slowly pulled away the sheet. Before, there had been nothing more frightening than seeing my reflection in the mirror. But that night, I realized there was one thing more terrifying than seeing my reflection. Not seeing it at all. I am an ER nurse. Something happened last night and I can't explain it. Everybody I have talked to has just sort of brushed it off, like I am making it up. But I swear, I'm telling the truth. I just need someone to believe me, so I am telling you guys here. We got a call last night that an ambulance was coming in hot with a heart attack patient that was unresponsive with no pulse. I looked at the report and he was picked up at a local park, where lots of homeless people like to sleep. Nobody who called knew him, and he had no ID. The ambulance found him passed out on the bench. The report said he was pale but not blue. If someone has been dead a while, they start to turn a shade of blue. So they rushed him in hoping there was still time to save him. A heart attack patient is nothing unusual for our ER. It happens frequently enough that we all know our jobs and were ready when the ambulance arrived. The paramedic was already performing CPR as he wheeled him straight from the back of an ambulance into the bay closest to the ambulance drop-off. This bay has all our trauma equipment and monitors. It just happened this was one of my 3 rooms for the shift. When he arrived, he was still pale white, no pulse, and showing no signs of life. It had been over 5 minutes since the paramedics found him and loaded him up. And he had not even a faint pulse the entire time. In a situation like this, we know the patient is basically gone, but we are still going to fight our hardest to get them back. It may be just a show for the family to tell them we did everything we could, or a way to get more money from insurance. But sometimes a person has no chance no matter what you do. Our team instantly went to work. We started CPR, started oxygen, injected him with nitroglycerin, hooked him up to the heart monitor, drew blood for labs, etc. We did everything right. After a few minutes of no response, the doctor called it. Time of death, 22:17. After a patient dies in the emergency room, everyone takes a moment to collect themselves, and then goes back to doing their job. This is part of working in the ER. People die. No matter how hard you fight, sometimes you come up short. It sucks, but you have to move on and put it behind you. It isn't a job for everybody, but death never has really bothered me. Everyone lives, and everyone dies. I'm just trying to help you live a little longer. Soon enough, the room was empty, outside of the recently deceased. I had 2 other rooms I had to tend to, so I left the patient in peace, while I got caught up with my other rooms I was assigned to. Once I was caught up, it was my job to get the body ready for transport. Basically, that means I unhook all the medical equipment like the heart monitor and oxygen mask, and fill out some paperwork. I went in the room and looked at the patient. He looked to be in his early 30s, in good shape, and looked like he would have been a handsome guy if he was alive. You don't normally see someone this young, and in such good shape, die this early from heart failure. It can happen, it just doesn't happen very often. I cleaned him up the best I could, and then tried to see if I could find some ID. We still had no idea who he was. I needed it for the paperwork, and to try to find out how to contact the next of kin. He was somebody's son, friend, possibly husband, or maybe even dad. Everybody is someone, and everybody has a name. Unfortunately, this person didn't have any wallet or any possessions on them. I looked at his pale face, and decided he looked like a James. I finished all the paperwork, and called the hospital morgue to come pick up the body. An ER is a busy place, and we need the room emptied so we can see the next patient. I went back into the room one last time. I always take a few minutes to say a prayer for the dead. I don't remember where I learned it, but I have always known it. I'm not religious, but it's just something small I do when I am alone with my patients after they pass. It is, "Eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon them. May the souls of all the faithful departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace." When I said Amen, a voice in the room said, "Amen. That was beautiful. Thank you." I opened my eyes as I jumped back and screamed out. I looked to the bed and there was James still on the bed, with his eyes open staring at me, and a gentle smile across his face. "But my name is not James, it's Michael," he said. "Oh my God, you're supposed to be dead," I said. "We gave you CPR, you had no pulse, you were definitely dead." I took a few steps back while staring at him in shock. This couldn't be real. "I know, CPR hurts. I bet you guys broke some ribs," he said and then laughed. "Look, I'm fine. I am talking and am moving my hands and legs. I'm a little sore, but I'll survive. I always do." "But you were dead. How is this even possible?" I asked. I took a few more steps towards the door. You're right, I was dead, and I still am dead, he said. We usually don't end up at the hospital, but I pushed myself a little too hard and slept right through them picking me up. I reached for the door. Once the CPR started, it woke me up in a hurry, and that really hurts, by the way, he said. It was too late to leave to do anything, so I had to just play dead. That is funny, right? A dead guy playing dead? I didn't laugh. I usually wait for them to take me to the morgue and then leave, but I don't have time for that today, he said as he started to stand up and button his shirt back. I didn't mean to scare you, but your prayer was so beautiful I couldn't resist. This isn't real, is it? I said. This is some weird dream I'm about